He treated her like garbage for 5 years. Every single day was a new humiliation. Every single morning she'd wake up in that tiny basement room and think about quitting, but the money kept her tied to that job. The money and the fear that she'd never find anything better. His name was Marcus Harrington, billionaire real estate mogul, CEO of one of the country's most successful development companies, and by every account, a man who had it all. Except he didn't. What he had was an obsession with control, with power, with reminding anyone beneath him exactly where they stood in the hierarchy of his world. Sarah Chen had worked as a maid in his sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city for 5 years. 5 years of waking up at 4 in the morning. 5 years of working until midnight. 5 years of listening to him criticize everything she did while never once looking her in the eye. The other staff members had quit within months. Not Sarah. Sarah stayed because she sent money to her mother back in her hometown, and because she'd learned early in life that survival sometimes meant swallowing your pride along with your dignity. The mansion was a testament to Marcus's wealth. 17,000 square feet of marble, mahogany, and Italian leather. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings that seemed to touch the sky. Art pieces that probably cost more than most people's homes decorated walls that Sarah cleaned obsessively, trying to achieve the impossible standard of perfection he demanded. She was invisible in that place. Not the good kind of invisible like the girls in those transformation stories, the ones who choose to hide. Sarah was invisible because Marcus made sure of it. He looked through her. When he gave her instructions, he addressed them to the wall behind her head. When she presented a meal she'd prepared, he'd grunt and push it aside without tasting it, claiming it smelled wrong, tasted wrong, looked wrong. Everything about her existence in that house was wrong by default. The other servants had warned her when she first started. Don't take it personally, they'd said. He's like that with everyone. But then they'd all left, one by one, driven out by the constant criticism and the psychological games. By the way he'd change expectations without warning. By the way he'd inspect her work with white gloves, literally running his fingers across surfaces, looking for dust that didn't exist. Sarah had stayed because she was different, or maybe because she had nowhere else to go, or maybe because she was just too tired to fight anymore. Her room was in the basement. A small, windowless space with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a single light bulb that flickered when the weather got cold. The walls were painted a shade of gray that seemed to absorb any light trying to enter. She'd tried to make it cheerful once, taping up a picture of her mother and some postcards from places she dreamed of visiting. Marcus had walked in during an inspection, saw the pictures, and told her they were unprofessional. She'd taken them down that same afternoon. The work was relentless. She cleaned 16 bathrooms by hand, each one to a standard of perfection that seemed designed to be impossible. She cooked elaborate meals that Marcus would critique based on things that had nothing to do with taste. The pasta was overcooked, he'd say, even though it was objectively perfectly al dente. The sauce was too red, he'd complain, which didn't even make sense. The vegetables were cut wrong, he'd declare, though they were cut identically to how he'd demanded them the day before. It was a game. A cruel game designed to make her feel incompetent, insufficient, unworthy of the space she took up in his world. And then there were the guests. Marcus would host elaborate dinner parties where he'd introduce Sarah to his friends with barely concealed contempt. "Look at my maid," he'd say, as if she were a curiosity exhibit at a museum. "She's been with me for 5 years and still can't seem to understand basic instructions." His friends would laugh, embarrassed but complicit. They'd exchange glances that said they felt uncomfortable but wouldn't dare challenge their host. Sarah would stand there in her gray uniform, hair pulled back so tightly it made her scalp hurt, and feel something inside her die a little bit more. There was a particular evening that stood out. A gala for one of his company's biggest development projects. Sarah had spent the entire day preparing the mansion for the celebration. She'd polished floors until her knees bled. She'd arranged flowers that cost more than her weekly salary. She'd prepared enough food to feed a small army, each dish a masterpiece of culinary precision. When the guests arrived, Marcus introduced his staff like we were museum pieces again, but this time he was particularly cruel. He actually pointed at Sarah and said to one of his business associates, "This one here, she's been with me the longest and she's still essentially useless. I keep her around because I'm a generous person, but she tests my patience constantly." Sarah had felt the words like physical blows. She'd looked around the room to see if anyone would challenge him, but no one did. These were powerful people, wealthy people, people who themselves employed staff, and probably understood the unspoken agreement to treat those beneath them with casual disrespect. One woman had smiled, actually smiled at the insult, and said, "You're patient, Marcus. I would have fired her months ago." That night, Sarah had lain in her basement room and cried in a way she hadn't allowed herself to cry in years. She'd thought about quitting. She'd thought about just walking out and letting the chips fall where they might. But her mother needed the money. Her mother was sick, and the medical bills kept piling up, and without this job, there was no way to cover them. So she'd cried herself to sleep and woken up the next morning to do it all over again. The years blended together. Seasons changed outside windows she rarely looked through. Christmas came and went. Marcus gave bonuses that were insulting, small checks that felt like mockery coming from someone with his wealth. New Year's arrived, and she'd make quiet resolutions to leave, to find something better, to stop accepting this treatment. But by February, she'd still be there, scrubbing the same floors, preparing the same meals, listening to the same criticisms. And then one day, everything changed. It started with a phone call. Sarah was in the kitchen preparing lunch when she heard shouting from Marcus's office. She'd heard him angry before, but this was different. This was panicked. She tried not to listen, but the walls of the mansion were thin in certain places, and his voice carried. "I don't care what it takes," he was saying. "Find her. I need her found immediately. Send every resource we have. And when you find her, do not let her know anything. Do you understand me? Do not speak to her. Do not approach her. You let me handle this personally." Sarah had continued chopping vegetables, trying to ignore the conversation. It was none of her business. Employees learn not to be curious about their employer's problems. Curiosity led to being fired, and she couldn't afford to be fired. But that evening, when she brought him dinner, she noticed something different about Marcus. He was nervous. His hands shook as he cut his food. He kept checking his phone. He looked like a man who'd lost something he couldn't find, something that mattered more than anything else in his carefully controlled world. The next morning, the news hit like a bomb. Sarah was in the kitchen with the other staff members, listening to the radio while she prepared breakfast, when the announcement came. The Prime Minister's daughter had gone missing 3 days ago. She was 26 years old, intelligent, philanthropic, beloved by the country, and she'd disappeared without a trace. The radio announcer described her as Sophia Harrington, an advocate for workers' rights and labor reform. She'd been missing since Tuesday morning. Police had no leads. The Prime Minister had issued a statement saying everything was being done to find his daughter, and he was offering a substantial reward for any information about her whereabouts. Sarah had frozen, a bowl in her hands, because the name had been familiar in a way she couldn't quite place. Harrington, the same last name as Marcus, the same last name as the man whose breakfast she was about to bring up to his office. She dismissed it as coincidence. There were probably thousands of Harringtons in the country. Still, the connection nagged at her as she moved through her morning routine. She'd made Marcus his coffee just how he liked it, his breakfast exactly as specified, and brought the tray up to his office with the same careful attention to detail she always employed. He was at his desk, looking like he hadn't slept. His tie was loosened, his shirt wrinkled. There were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of a sleepless night. When she entered, he barely glanced at her. "Leave it on the desk," he said, not bothering to look up from his computer screen. She did as instructed, but before she could leave, he spoke again. "Have you heard the news about the Prime Minister's daughter?" Sarah had paused, unsure if he was actually asking her or just thinking out loud. She'd heard about it on the radio, yes, she'd said carefully. "If you see anything unusual, anything at all, you're to tell me immediately," he'd said, finally looking at her, and his eyes were intense in a way that frightened her. "Do you understand? No police. You come directly to me." Sarah had nodded, not understanding, but knowing better than to ask questions. For the next several days, the entire country seemed to be focused on finding Sophia Harrington. Police searched everywhere. Her friends were interviewed. Her last known movements were analyzed. Theories emerged and were dismissed. The Prime Minister made emotional appeals on television. The country held its collective breath. And Marcus seemed to deteriorate before Sarah's eyes. He stopped eating. He paced his office at all hours. He made phone calls that seemed to go nowhere. Once, she heard him arguing with someone, saying things like, "This was supposed to be contained. This was supposed to stay quiet. You were supposed to be handling this." Sarah tried to stay out of his way. She did her work, kept her head down, and attempted to ignore the strange tension that had settled over the mansion. But it was impossible to ignore completely. It was on a Thursday morning when the police arrived. Sarah was cleaning the downstairs parlor when she heard the sound of multiple vehicles in the driveway. She moved to the window and saw them, line after line of police cars, each one with lights flashing silently. Officers emerged from the vehicles in a coordinated movement that spoke of military precision. This wasn't a routine visit. This was a raid. She watched as they approached the mansion, and her heart began to race. She'd never had any interaction with the police beyond a speeding ticket years ago, but the sight of so many of them, with such obvious purpose, was terrifying. She wondered if Marcus had done something illegal. Given the way he treated people, she wouldn't have been surprised. The front door opened, and she heard Marcus's voice, confused, demanding to know what this was about. Then came the sound of officers announcing themselves and presenting a warrant. Sarah heard the words search and missing person and Sophia Harrington. Sophia Harrington, the Prime Minister's daughter, missing. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to make the connection. Why would Marcus be involved in her disappearance? What could possibly connect her to him? And then, in that moment of standing frozen in the parlor, listening to police officers moving through the mansion, searching, questioning, it suddenly clicked into place. Harrington, it was his last name too. What if they were related? What if Sophia was his daughter? But that didn't make sense either, because if she was his daughter, why would she be missing? Why would the Prime Minister, her father presumably, not mention that Marcus was her father? The Prime Minister had never, in any statement Sarah had heard, mentioned a husband or ex-husband or family connection to Marcus Harrington the billionaire. Sarah heard footsteps approaching the parlor, and she immediately returned to her dusting, trying to look as inconspicuous as possible. An officer entered, a woman with sharp eyes and a badge that identified her as Detective Morrison. "Are you employed here?" the officer asked. "Yes, I'm the maid," Sarah said, keeping her voice neutral, her posture submissive. "How long have you worked for Mr. Harrington?" 5 years. "Have you noticed anything unusual recently? Any strange visitors? Any signs of distress?" Sarah hesitated. She thought about the phone call she'd overheard, the panic in Marcus's voice, the insomnia, the deterioration. But she also thought about survival and employment, and the precarious position she occupied in this world. "No, nothing unusual," she lied. "He's been traveling quite a bit, I think. But otherwise, everything's been normal." The detective studied her for a long moment, and Sarah had the feeling that this woman could see through lies. But the officer didn't push, just nodded and moved on to continue her search. Over the next several hours, the mansion was turned inside out. Police searched every room, every closet, every inch of space. They took photographs and collected evidence. They questioned Marcus for hours, while Sarah and the other staff members were kept in the kitchen, away from the activity. Finally, as the sun was beginning to set, the police began to leave. Sarah watched from the kitchen window as the officers departed, their vehicles driving away in the same coordinated way they'd arrived. Marcus emerged from his office looking haunted. He called all the staff together and made a simple announcement. "There will be no discussion of this with anyone," he said. "Not with friends, not with family, not with anyone. If anyone asks, you say nothing. Am I understood?" Everyone nodded, including Sarah. He locked himself in his office after that, and Sarah heard him make several phone calls. She caught fragments of conversation, something about making arrangements, something about a conversation he needed to have, something about damage control and keeping certain information contained. That evening, Sarah went to her basement room and lay in bed, trying to understand what she'd witnessed. She turned on the small radio she kept by her bed, and the news was all about the police search of Marcus's property. There was speculation that he might be involved in Sophia's disappearance, but authorities weren't releasing any information. The Prime Minister had made another statement saying his daughter remained missing and that the police were pursuing multiple leads. But something felt wrong. If Marcus had kidnapped Sophia, The police would have found evidence. If he'd harmed her, they would have found something. Instead, they'd left, which meant either they'd found nothing or they'd found something that sent them in a different direction. The next morning, Sarah's life changed forever. She was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when there was a sound from upstairs. Not the usual sound of Marcus moving around, but something else. Something like something had fallen. She heard him call out, his voice strange, panicked. She left the breakfast preparation and hurried upstairs, something she normally would never do without being summoned. But his tone had been so alarmed that she moved without thinking. She found him in the hallway outside his master bedroom, staring at something with an expression of complete shock. She followed his gaze and saw it. A woman, emerging from what she'd always been told was a locked storage closet. A woman with dark hair and intelligent eyes, wearing clothes that looked like they belonged to someone who'd been living rough. The woman looked at Marcus with an expression of absolute fury. "You're finished," the woman said, her voice low and controlled. Every conversation recorded, every text message documented, every threat preserved for evidence. "The police don't have what I collected because I wanted to have a conversation with you first. But that conversation is over, and now they will have everything." Sarah felt the world tilt. She didn't understand what was happening, but she could see something fundamental shifting in the dynamic before her eyes. The woman turned and looked at Sarah, and in that moment, Sarah saw something that made the connection finally, truly click into place. The intelligence in her eyes. The way she held herself, even now, even disheveled and exhausted, with a kind of authority that couldn't be faked. The resemblance in the shape of her face to photographs she'd seen on television. This was Sophia Harrington. This was the Prime Minister's daughter. "You must be Sarah," Sophia said, and her voice was different now, warmer, focused on her rather than her father. "I've heard so much about how you've been treated. I'm sorry, I'm so incredibly sorry. My father is a monster and I should have known, I should have figured it out sooner." Sarah didn't know what to say. She stood frozen, trying to process what was happening. Marcus made a move toward Sophia, but she held up her hand, and despite the fact that he was a powerful man and she was a young woman who'd apparently been held somewhere in his house for days, he stopped. Just stopped, because something in her bearing, her confidence, her authority, made it clear that he no longer had power in this scenario. "You will not touch me," Sophia said. "You will not speak to me. You will wait right here while I call the police and tell them everything. And then you will face the consequences for years of psychological abuse, illegal detention, and whatever other crimes they find when they investigate what you've been doing in this house." She pulled out her phone and dialed. When the officer answered, she identified herself clearly and explained that she was at her father's property, that she was safe, and that she needed police presence immediately. Within 20 minutes, the mansion was filled with officers again. But this time they weren't searching. This time they were making an arrest. Sarah watched as Marcus was handcuffed and read his rights. She watched as he tried to speak, to explain, to deny, but his words fell on ears that had already heard enough. Detective Morrison approached Sarah as she stood in the kitchen, still wearing her gray uniform, still feeling invisible. "We'd like to get a statement from you," the detective said gently, "if you're willing." Sarah had nodded, and for the next several hours she told the story of 5 years of psychological abuse, 5 years of systematic humiliation, 5 years of living in a basement room, treated as less than human, serving a man who seemed to take pleasure in her suffering. She'd talked about the pattern of control, the impossible standards, the public humiliation, the isolation. She detailed specific incidents that had damaged her soul piece by piece. She described the way he'd made her feel like she was inherently wrong, that her very existence was a failure. And as she talked, Sophia had sat with her, occasionally asking clarifying questions, occasionally squeezing her hand in a gesture of solidarity and understanding. It turned out that Marcus had detained his daughter against her will for 7 days. He'd kept her isolated in a room with minimal supplies, telling her that she was going to recant her public statements about labor rights and workers' protection, that she was going to stop embarrassing him with her activism, that she needed to accept her position as his daughter, and understand that certain truths had to remain unspoken. Sophia had refused. She'd had a phone that she'd hidden, and she'd documented everything. She'd recorded his threats, his psychological manipulation, his admission that he'd engineered her kidnapping through intermediaries to make it look like she was in danger, forcing her to come home so he could deal with her in private. When her location was finally traced through her hidden phone, police had arrived to find her exactly where she'd been all along, in that storage closet that Marcus had converted into a private space, one that no one else in the mansion was supposed to know about. Marcus had built an empire on controlling people. He'd built it on the assumption that wealth meant absolute authority over anyone he employed, but he'd made a crucial miscalculation with his daughter. He'd assumed that even if she didn't love him, she would still obey him, that her position as his daughter would override her principles. He'd been wrong. The trial lasted 4 months. The evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution presented witness after witness, including Sarah, who testified about the systematic abuse she'd endured. They presented Sophia's recordings. They presented documentation of years of psychological manipulation and criminal behavior. Marcus's defense was weak. He tried to claim that his treatment of staff was simply high standards, that his detention of Sophia was meant to protect her from her own poor choices, that everything he'd done was within his rights as an employer and a father. The court did not agree. He was convicted on multiple charges, including unlawful imprisonment, psychological abuse, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. His assets were frozen pending civil settlements. His company was taken over by the board of directors, and his name was erased from it in everything but legal history. But what happened after the conviction was perhaps more important than the conviction itself. Sarah had expected that her employment would simply end, that she'd be cast back out into the world with 5 years of experience working for a man now known to be a monster. A name on a resume that would probably raise red flags for any potential employer. She'd expected to struggle, to search for new employment, to rebuild her life from the wreckage of the old one. Instead, Sophia had approached her with an offer. "I want you to work for me," Sophia had said. "Not as a maid, though. That's not what I need. What I need is a personal assistant. Someone I trust. Someone who understands what it's like to be treated as less than human by people who should know better. Someone who can help me in my work to reform labor laws and worker protections." Sarah had been stunned. She'd stammered something about not having the qualifications, about never having done that kind of work before. Sophia had smiled, and it was a warm, genuine smile that Sarah had rarely seen directed at her. "You survived 5 years with my father," Sophia had said. "You were kind to me during the trial. You told the truth when it would have been easier to lie. Those are the only qualifications I need. Everything else I can teach you." So Sarah had said yes. She'd left the gray maid's uniform behind and put on professional clothes. She'd moved out of the basement room and into a small apartment that Sophia helped her find. She'd started traveling with Sophia, attending events where the Prime Minister's daughter was pushing forward reforms to protect workers. She'd begun a new life. And in that new life, Sarah discovered things about herself that she'd forgotten. She discovered that she was intelligent, that she had good instincts, that she was capable of more than she'd believed possible. She discovered that the 5 years hadn't broken her, they'd only hidden her, and now she was slowly, carefully, revealing herself again. Sophia became her mentor and eventually her closest friend. The two women bonded over shared trauma and a shared determination to make sure that what had happened to them didn't continue to happen to others. Sarah began to speak publicly about her experience. At first, it was difficult. Talking about 5 years of abuse and humiliation in front of crowds of people felt like exposing wounds that had barely healed. But she found that her story resonated with people. Workers who'd experienced similar treatment reached out to her with their own stories. People in precarious employment situations found hope in her journey from invisibility to visibility. She began to work on labor reform efforts with Sophia. She helped develop programs to protect domestic workers, to establish minimum standards for treatment, to create channels for reporting abuse without fear of retaliation. She became a voice for people who didn't have one. 6 months after Marcus's conviction, Sarah was invited to speak at an international labor summit. She stood on a stage in front of thousands of people from around the world and told her story. She talked about the 5 years in the basement. She talked about the humiliation and the abuse. And she talked about how a single person, someone with power and principles, had chosen to use that power to change her trajectory. In the audience, Sophia sat with tears running down her face, proud of her friend, proud of what Sarah had become. After the speech, Sarah received standing ovation. She stood on that stage, no longer invisible, no longer treated as less than human, and she felt something like vindication. Not revenge, but something deeper. She felt like herself again. The story of Marcus and Sophia and Sarah became a turning point in the national conversation about workers' rights and power dynamics. It was a story about what could happen when someone with power chose to use it for good instead of for control. It was a story about resilience and friendship and second chances. And it was a story that changed laws. Within a year, the country had passed new legislation establishing protections for domestic workers. Employers who treated staff with systematic abuse could now face criminal charges, not just civil suits. Worker hotlines were established to report mistreatment. Training programs were created to educate employers about appropriate workplace conduct. Marcus Harrington's cruelty became the impetus for change that he could never have anticipated. Years later, when interviews were conducted about the case, people often asked Sarah if she harbored any lingering anger toward Marcus. She would pause before answering, considering the question carefully. "I don't have room for anger anymore," she would say. "I spent 5 years in that basement with anger, and it only hurt me. What I have now is something more valuable. I have purpose. I have a friend who believes in me. I have work that matters. And I have the knowledge that what happened to me is now part of the reason that fewer people will have to experience what I experienced." Marcus created a monster, yes, but he did so in a way that eventually led to transformation, not just for me, but for countless others. Sarah's life became one of influence and impact. She traveled the world, speaking about workers' rights. She worked with organizations that provided support to people escaping abusive employment situations. She became a mentor to younger people who'd experienced trauma and were rebuilding their lives. The basement room in Marcus's mansion was demolished. The mansion itself was eventually sold, with the proceeds going partially to a foundation that Sarah established to support abused workers. The foundation became one of the most effective labor advocacy organizations in the country, providing legal support, housing assistance, and mental health resources to people escaping exploitation. Sophia remained Prime Minister for 2 terms, and during her tenure, she continued to prioritize labor reforms. She credited Sarah with being the conscience of her administration, the voice that kept her grounded in the reality of what regular people faced. The 2 women became synonymous with worker advocacy, and their friendship became legendary, a story of how trauma could be transformed into healing, and how women could support each other in creating change. The case of Sarah and Marcus Harrington is one that's often cited in discussions about workplace power dynamics and the importance of accountability for those who abuse their positions of authority. It's a reminder that invisibility isn't always chosen, that humiliation leaves marks that take time to heal, but that healing is possible. It's a reminder that power doesn't have to be used to dominate, that it can be used to lift others up, that the people we might have overlooked, the people we've treated as less than human, might contain within them strength and worth that we never bothered to recognize. And it's a reminder that the person you treat badly today might be the person who changes tomorrow. Not because they're plotting revenge, but because they refuse to let the abuse define them. If you've found yourself in a situation similar to Sarah's, know that you're not alone. Know that what's being done to you is not okay, that your suffering is not your fault, and that there are people and organizations ready to help you find a way out. Reach out, tell your story, because your story matters, your experience matters, and you matter far more than anyone who treats you as invisible could ever understand. The transformation of Sarah from an invisible maid to a respected advocate didn't happen overnight. It happened because she was brave enough to speak her truth when it mattered most. It happened because someone with power chose to extend that power to lift her up rather than maintain it to keep her down. And it can happen for you too. The basement may feel permanent. The invisibility may feel permanent. The humiliation may feel permanent, but none of it is. You have worth, you have value, and you deserve to be seen. So if you or someone you know is being treated the way Sarah was treated, don't stay silent. Reach out, make a call, send a message. Tell someone, Because somewhere out there, there's someone like Sophia who can help. There's someone who believes that your life matters, and they're waiting to hear your story so they can help you transform it into something powerful. The case of Marcus Harrington taught the world a crucial lesson about power and responsibility. It showed that no amount of wealth can buy immunity from consequence. It showed that the people we overlook are often the strongest among us. And it showed that when we choose to use our power to help rather than to hurt, we can change not just individual lives, but the fabric of society itself. Remember Sarah. Remember what she endured. And remember what she became. Because in her story is a reminder that your story matters too, and that no matter how invisible you feel right now, you have the potential to become visible, powerful, and free. But what many people don't realize is that the night the police stormed Marcus Harrington's mansion, it wasn't just a dramatic confrontation between a billionaire and his victim. It was the culmination of months of careful investigation, strategic planning, and emotional preparation that nobody outside a small circle knew was happening. The story of how it all came together is just as powerful as the moment itself, and it reveals something profound about the nature of justice, privilege, and the invisible networks that sometimes protect us when we're at our most vulnerable. Let's go back to 3 months before that night. Sarah was still working in the mansion, still enduring the daily humiliations that had become the rhythm of her life. She'd learned to move through the halls like a ghost, to anticipate Marcus's moods, to make herself small enough that he might forget she was there altogether. But something was beginning to shift inside her. It wasn't hope exactly. Hope felt too fragile, too easily destroyed. It was something quieter, more stubborn. It was the beginning of a question: how much longer can I do this? And for the first time, she was actually allowing herself to consider that the answer might be, not much longer. That's when a woman named Dr. Lisa Chen came to the Harrington mansion to treat Marcus's chronic back pain. Dr. Chen was a specialist, brought in by Marcus's personal physician, and she was scheduled to visit twice a week. She was professional, efficient, and she noticed Sarah immediately in a way that most people didn't. It wasn't pity or even sympathy at first. It was observation. Dr. Chen had worked with survivors of abuse in her previous practice. She knew the signs: the way Sarah flinched at sudden noises, the way she kept her eyes down unless directly addressed, the careful, controlled movements that suggested someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. On the second visit, while setting up her equipment in Marcus's study, Dr. Chen asked Sarah a simple question. She asked her name, and then she asked if she was okay. It was such a basic thing, such a small gesture of human recognition, that Sarah actually had to step into the hallway to compose herself. No one had asked her that in years. No one had cared enough to ask. And when she came back inside, something in her had shifted. Dr. Chen gave her a card. She told Sarah that if she ever needed to talk to someone, or if she ever needed help, she should call. She said it quietly, making sure Marcus wouldn't hear. She said it like she meant it. Sarah kept that card for 2 weeks before she did anything with it. She carried it in her pocket, pulled it out when she was alone in her small room at night, and tried to imagine what it would mean to actually make that call. But fear is a powerful paralytic. Fear of retaliation. Fear of having nowhere to go. Fear of not being believed. Fear of the consequences of speaking out against a man with the resources to destroy her reputation, to make sure she could never work again, to hunt her down if she tried to leave. What Sarah didn't know was that Dr. Chen had already called someone. She had contacted her sister, who worked in the Prime Minister's office as a policy advisor. And that sister had mentioned a conversation to the Prime Minister, Sophia herself, during a routine meeting. It was a passing mention, a small detail in a larger conversation about workplace rights and abuse. But Sophia had paused. She'd asked questions. She'd wanted to know more. This is the part of the story that rarely gets told, because it happens in private offices and secure phone calls. But it's the machinery of justice, the part that doesn't make for dramatic television, but that makes everything else possible. Sophia began to investigate. She used her position carefully, quietly, asking the right questions to the right people. She learned about Sarah. She learned about the mansion. She learned about a pattern of behavior that stretched back years, involving not just Sarah but other staff members who had come and gone. And here's where something remarkable happened. Instead of going directly to the police or the media, Sophia did something that required real courage. She decided to go to Sarah first. She wanted to know what Sarah wanted. She wanted to give Sarah agency in her own story, rather than turning her into a prop in a narrative about powerful women saving vulnerable ones. So Sophia arranged to meet with Sarah. It took weeks to set up and the planning was intricate. A day off for Sarah, a location far from the mansion, a meeting that would look, to anyone watching, like nothing at all, just two women having coffee. When Sarah walked into that coffee shop and saw the woman waiting for her, a woman who introduced herself as Sophia and who somehow conveyed both authority and warmth in the same moment, she didn't immediately understand what was happening. Sophia ordered her tea, asked how she liked it, paid attention to the answer in a way that suggested she actually cared. And then, gently, she began to explain. She explained that Dr. Chen had reached out, that she worked in the Prime Minister's office, that she knew about Marcus, that she wanted to help, but that Sarah got to decide what help looked like. She didn't pressure, she didn't make promises she couldn't keep. She simply laid out the facts and the options, and then she waited. Sarah cried. She cried in a coffee shop with a stranger who happened to be one of the most powerful women in the country, and Sophia didn't try to comfort her with empty platitudes. She just handed her tissues and let her feel what she needed to feel. And when Sarah finally stopped crying, she told her story. She told it slowly at first, then faster, the words tumbling out as if a dam had broken inside her. She told about the insults and the unreasonable demands. She told about the time Marcus threw a bowl of soup because it was too hot, and she had to clean the scalding liquid off the tile floor while he watched. She told about the constant surveillance, the accusations of theft, the way he monitored who she spoke to and where she went on her days off. By the end, Sophia knew everything, and Sarah knew that she wasn't alone with this anymore. Someone powerful believed her. Someone with resources and connections and authority believed that what had happened to her was real and wrong and actionable. What happened next required a level of coordination that most people never see. Sophia couldn't handle this through normal channels, because those channels were slow and sometimes compromised. She needed to move carefully. She brought in someone she trusted completely, a woman named Detective Maria Reeves, who had spent 15 years investigating financial crimes and workplace abuse. Maria had an intuition for patterns, for the small details that revealed larger systems of exploitation. Together, Maria and Sophia began to build a case. But they knew that Sarah's testimony alone, while powerful, might not be enough. They needed documentation. They needed corroboration, so they began to investigate Marcus's past. They found the other workers. There was Anita, who had worked for Marcus 8 years ago and had left suddenly without notice. They tracked her down living in another city, working a completely different job, and she agreed to talk. Her story was similar to Sarah's but with different details. A different kind of humiliation. A different breaking point. There was James, who had been Marcus's personal assistant for 6 months before quitting. James had kept a journal. He'd documented incidents, dates, things Marcus had said. He'd been thinking about reporting it for years, but never had the courage. With support from Maria and Sophia, he finally agreed to share those documents. There was also financial documentation that painted a picture of how Marcus operated. His bank records showed erratic, often cruel payments to staff, bonuses withheld, wages reduced without warning, money deducted for things like breaking a glass, or being late, or simply disrespect. These weren't the financial transactions of someone struggling with anger management. These were the calculated actions of someone who understood that power over money was power over people. But Marcus was also careful. He was clever. He'd never been physically violent to Sarah in a way that would leave marks. He'd never explicitly threatened her. Everything existed in a gray zone where someone could theoretically argue that he was just demanding, just exacting. That's why the case required more than just testimony. It required context. Sophia brought in psychologists who specialized in workplace trauma. They reviewed the testimony from Sarah and the others and confirmed what was already becoming clear. This was a pattern of psychological abuse. It was systematic. It was designed to control, and it had caused real, measurable harm. During this time, Sarah continued to work at the mansion. She continued to endure Marcus's behavior, but now she knew it was temporary. Now she had a purpose beyond just surviving to the next day. She was building a case. She was gathering evidence. And she was doing it with the backing of people who had power. There was a moment, about 6 weeks into this secret investigation, when Marcus demanded that Sarah work a night shift. He wanted his study reorganized, every book catalogued and arranged a particular way. He said it in front of guests, humiliating her in front of people who hardly acknowledged her existence anyway. And something in Sarah's face shifted. One of the guests, a woman named Patricia who worked in business development, actually noticed. She watched the way Sarah's jaw tightened, the way her hands clenched briefly before she forced them open again. Patricia was someone Marcus knew socially, someone he'd been trying to impress for years. And after Sarah had left the room, Patricia said something casual that would change everything. She said, "That girl looks like she's about to snap. You might want to be careful." Marcus laughed it off. He said Sarah was fine, that she was actually lucky to have a job like this, that plenty of people would kill to work for someone like him. But Patricia had planted a seed of doubt in his mind. Not doubt about whether he was doing anything wrong, Marcus would never arrive at that conclusion, but doubt about whether Sarah might suddenly become a problem. And that doubt, that paranoia, actually accelerated everything. Because the moment Marcus began to genuinely worry that Sarah might leave or report him, he became less careful. He began to have more conversations with his lawyer. He began to delete emails. He began to make phone calls that suggested he was aware that what he was doing might be illegal. All of this became part of the case. Maria and Sophia were watching. They were listening. And they were waiting for the moment when they had everything they needed. That moment came on a Thursday morning when Marcus had a conversation in his home office, not realizing that his housekeeper had left a smartphone recording in the plant behind his desk, a plant Sarah had placed there on Maria's instruction weeks earlier. In that conversation, Marcus discussed with his lawyer how to make Sarah disappear as a threat. He talked about having enough money to ensure that if she tried to go to the authorities, nobody would believe her. He talked about having already made her life so difficult that she probably wouldn't even bother. He talked like a man who believed himself to be above consequence, that the rules that applied to everyone else simply didn't apply to him. That recording was the final piece. That was when Sophia and Maria knew they were ready. The planning of the raid itself required months of preparation. They had to coordinate with local police, with federal investigators who specialized in labor law violations, with legal teams who would ensure that everything was handled correctly so that it would hold up in court. They had to prepare Sarah for what was coming, because that night was going to be traumatic in a completely different way. Sarah had to go home and pretend everything was normal. She had to go through a full day of work with Marcus, knowing what was about to happen. Maria and Sophia prepared her by role-playing, by talking through what she might feel, by reminding her that everything that was about to happen was happening to protect her, not to harm her. On the evening of the raid, Sarah packed a small bag with the essentials. She said goodbye to the mansion in her mind, though she didn't know it would be goodbye forever. She was ready as anyone can be for something like this. When the police arrived at 9 in the evening, there were 6 of them. They had a warrant. They had documentation. They had testimony from multiple sources, and they had the recording. Within minutes, Marcus Harrington, billionaire, philanthropist, man of standing in the community, was sitting on his leather sofa in handcuffs. The arrest made headlines the next morning. Billionaire arrested for labor law violations and psychological abuse. But what the headlines couldn't capture was what happened in the hours afterward. What happened when Sarah was able to walk out of that mansion for the last time as a free person? What happened when she realized that she didn't have to go back? What happened when the weight she'd been carrying for so long finally began to lift? But the arrest was just the beginning of another phase of the story. Because now everything became public. Now Marcus's lawyers began their counterattack. They argued that Sarah was simply a disgruntled employee seeking attention. They hired their own psychologists to dispute the findings of the trauma specialists. They tried to paint the narrative as a bitter woman trying to bring down a successful man. They used every tool available to them, which was considerable. This is the part of the story that matters because this is where most cases fall apart. This is where many survivors find themselves up against machinery so powerful, and so well-funded that they simply can't compete. They become exhausted. They second-guess themselves. They wonder if maybe the accused is right, maybe they're just being difficult, maybe they're misremembering, maybe it wasn't that bad. But Sarah had something different. She had Sophia. She had Maria. She had Dr. Chen. She had James and Anita and Patricia. She had a network of people who believed her and who had the resources to stand beside her through what was coming. The trial lasted 4 months. During that time, Sarah testified for 3 days. She sat in a courtroom with Marcus Harrington sitting 20 feet away from her, and she told her story. She told about the years of humiliation. She talked about what it felt like to be treated as less than human. She talked about the way it had affected her self-worth, her ability to trust, her ability to see herself as valuable. Marcus's lawyer attacked her relentlessly. He questioned her memory. He suggested she was exaggerating. He tried to make her admit that perhaps Marcus was simply a demanding employer, that perhaps she was simply not suited to the work. And through all of it, Sarah stayed calm. She stayed truthful. She didn't let herself be baited into anger or desperation. The other witnesses testified too. James read from his journal. Anita described her experience. Dr. Chen testified about the psychological impact of the abuse she'd documented. Patricia testified about what she'd observed. And the evidence was presented, the recordings, the financial records, the documented patterns of behavior. What became clear through the testimony was that Marcus's behavior wasn't the behavior of someone with anger management issues or someone who was simply demanding. It was the behavior of someone who deliberately controlled others through humiliation and financial manipulation. It was systematic, it was intentional, and it had violated multiple labor laws and workplace protection standards. The verdict came down on a Tuesday afternoon in October, guilty on all counts. The courtroom was silent for a moment as if everyone was processing what had just happened. A billionaire, convicted, not of a white-collar crime involving money, but of something more fundamental, the mistreatment of another human being. Marcus's face didn't show emotion. His lawyers immediately announced plans to appeal. His family released a statement saying they stood by him and that this was a miscarriage of justice. But those words rang hollow, because the evidence had been clear. Sarah left the courthouse with Sophia and Maria, and photographers tried to follow them, trying to get pictures, trying to capture this moment. But Sarah didn't hide. She didn't try to avoid the cameras. She looked directly at them, and in that moment, she reclaimed her own narrative. She was no longer the invisible maid. She was a woman who had spoken the truth and had been believed. What happened in the weeks after the conviction was less dramatic, but perhaps more important. Sarah worked with a therapist, a trauma specialist recommended by Sophia, to begin the long process of healing. She moved out of the servants' quarters and into an apartment of her own. She started to rebuild her life in ways that had nothing to do with serving anyone or being at anyone's beck and call. And she started to think about what came next. Sophia had offered her a job in the Prime Minister's office, working on labor rights and workplace protection policies. It wasn't something Sarah had ever imagined for herself, but it felt right. It felt like taking something that had hurt her and transforming it into something that could help others. There's a psychological principle called post-traumatic growth. It's the idea that after trauma, some people don't just recover, they actually grow in ways they couldn't have imagined before. They develop resilience. They develop compassion. They develop a clarity about what matters and what doesn't. Sarah experienced this, but not immediately and not without struggle. In the months after the trial, she had nightmares. She had days when she felt paralyzed by shame, even though she knew intellectually that she had nothing to be ashamed of. She had moments of profound anger that would come out of nowhere. She had to learn, with professional help, that healing isn't linear, that it's not something you arrive at and then you're done. That it's an ongoing process of confronting what happened to you and choosing, over and over again, to believe that you deserve better. But she also experienced something else. She started to meet other people who had gone through similar situations. Sophia introduced her to a network of abuse survivors who had all gone through their own processes of healing and recovery. Some of them worked in advocacy. Some of them worked in government. Some of them had started their own organizations. They formed a kind of sisterhood, a group of women who understood without having to explain, who could sit in silence together and know that the silence meant something. One of these women, a woman named Keisha who had survived abuse at the hands of a corporate executive, told Sarah something that became foundational to her healing. Keisha said, "The thing about what happened to us is that it wasn't our fault, but our healing is our responsibility. And that actually gives us power. Because healing is something we control. They controlled our lives, but they don't control our recovery." Sarah started to think about this differently. She started to see her healing not as something that was happening to her, but as something she was actively doing. And with that shift came a sense of agency that she'd never had before. She started to write. She wrote about her experience, sometimes for her own processing, sometimes with the idea of eventually sharing it with others. She started to volunteer with an organization that supported domestic workers, helping them understand their rights and connect them with resources. And slowly, almost without realizing it, she became someone different. Not in the sense that she forgot what had happened, but in the sense that she integrated it into her story in a way that didn't define her anymore. She was Sarah the survivor, yes, but she was also Sarah the advocate, Sarah the writer, Sarah the person who had stood up against someone powerful and refused to be erased. The case of Sarah and Marcus Harrington did become a legal precedent. Lower courts began to cite it when making decisions about workplace abuse cases. The documentation of psychological abuse as a form of labor violation became more standardized. And perhaps most importantly, it gave permission to other abuse survivors to come forward. If Sarah could do it, maybe they could too. Maybe they wouldn't have to endure in silence anymore. In the year after the conviction, 3 other women came forward with their own stories about Marcus Harrington. Marcus's sentencing was adjusted based on this new information. He received 5 years in prison, with the understanding that this was not the end of the case. There would be civil suits. There would be financial restitution. The process of accountability was just beginning. But while Marcus faced his own reckoning, Sarah was building something different. She was building a life. She was building a career. She was building relationships based on honesty and mutual respect rather than fear and power imbalance. And she was beginning to understand that her story, the full story, including all the pain and all the growth, was something powerful that she could offer to the world. 2 years had passed since Marcus Harrington's conviction when Sarah received an unexpected call. It was from a journalist named David Chen, who worked for one of the country's largest investigative news outlets. He had been following her case, he explained, and he wanted to do something bigger with it. Not just a profile piece, but a full documentary investigation into the systemic abuse of domestic workers across the country. He believed Sarah's story was the thread that could tie the whole narrative together, but more than that, he believed she was the right person to help him tell it. Sarah's first instinct was to say no. She had worked hard to build a life that wasn't entirely defined by what had happened to her. The advocacy work was fulfilling, but it was contained. It was manageable. A documentary would mean reopening everything. It would mean her face on screens across the country. It would mean strangers knowing intimate details of her suffering. It would mean confronting her trauma all over again, but this time in front of cameras. She sat with that discomfort for 3 days. She called Sophia. She went to one of her support group meetings and listened to others talk about their own struggles with visibility. One woman, Marcus, said something that struck her. "Sometimes we think that by staying quiet about what happened, we're protecting ourselves. But we're really just protecting the people who hurt us. We're giving them permission to keep doing it." That conversation shifted something. Sarah realized that her hesitation wasn't really about protecting herself. It was about protecting other people's comfort. It was about not wanting to make powerful people uncomfortable. And wasn't that, in a way, the same pattern that had allowed Marcus Harrington to abuse her for so long? Everyone had known. The neighbors had heard the shouting. Other household staff had witnessed the humiliation. His friends had seen the signs. But everyone had stayed quiet because confronting him would have been uncomfortable. She called David back and said yes. The documentary project took 18 months. Sarah worked with David and his team to identify other survivors willing to share their stories. There was Maria, who had worked for a tech CEO and had been locked in the house during her time off. There was Jennifer, who had been sexually harassed by her employer's adult son while the employer watched and did nothing. There was Keiko, who had been underpaid by tens of thousands of dollars over the course of a decade, money her employer had simply pocketed while she lived in poverty in his mansion. And there were dozens of others, each with their own variation on the theme of exploitation and powerlessness. But the documentary wasn't just stories. David and his team did deep investigative work. They found financial records showing that Marcus Harrington had been systematically underpaying domestic workers for years before Sarah, building a pattern of behavior. They interviewed psychologists about the long-term impacts of psychological abuse in isolated work environments. They spoke with labor lawyers about the gaps in legal protections for domestic workers. They tracked how many cases like this were happening every year, how many were being reported, and most tellingly, how many were being covered up or ignored entirely. One of the most powerful sequences in the documentary came when David managed to get an interview with one of Marcus Harrington's friends, a venture capitalist named Richard Blackwell. Richard had known Marcus for 30 years. They'd gone to the same elite prep school, the same Ivy League university, belonged to the same clubs. When David asked him directly whether he had ever witnessed Marcus behaving abusively toward his staff, Richard's face went through a series of emotions: discomfort, defensiveness, and then something that looked like shame. "Look," Richard finally said, "we all knew Marcus could be difficult. But that's not the same as abuse. That's just how he was. He was demanding. He had high standards. That's what you get when you hire someone who demands excellence." David leaned forward. One of his former employees describes being told that her weight made her disgusting to look at on a daily basis. Another describes being denied bathroom breaks. Another describes being blamed for her employer's personal failures and receiving hours-long tirades about her incompetence. Is that demanding excellence, or is that psychological abuse? Richard didn't answer for a long time. Finally, he said quietly, "I don't know anymore." That moment, that admission of not knowing, that crack in the facade, became central to the documentary's power, because it showed that this wasn't about monsters. Marcus Harrington wasn't some aberration, some unusual evil. He was a man from a privileged background who had been enabled by his entire social circle to believe that his wealth gave him the right to treat people beneath him however he wanted. And his friends had enabled that belief through their silence. The documentary premiered at a major film festival to significant acclaim. Critics praised the investigative rigor, the emotional depth of the survivor testimonies, and the way it contextualized individual stories within larger systemic failures. But more importantly, it sparked something in the public consciousness. Stories about domestic worker abuse started appearing in the news with greater frequency. Several state legislatures introduced bills to strengthen protections for domestic workers. A major hotel chain revised its policies on how housekeeping staff should be treated. And perhaps most significantly, more workers came forward with their own stories. For Sarah, the attention was both validating and overwhelming. She did interviews. She spoke at universities. She was invited to testify before a legislative committee considering new worker protection laws. But with each public appearance, she also received hate mail. People who believed that she had exaggerated her story, or that she was a gold digger trying to take advantage of a successful man, or that she was part of some larger conspiracy to tear down wealthy people. One person sent her a letter saying that if she had just done her job better, none of this would have happened. Those letters hurt, even though intellectually Sarah knew they said nothing true about her. But she had learned something important from her support group and from Keisha's original insight. She could acknowledge the hurt without letting it define her. She could feel wounded by the cruelty and still maintain her sense of purpose. She started keeping a journal where she would write down the worst things people said about her, not to internalize them but to examine them. She would ask herself, "Is this true? What am I afraid it might mean about me?" And then she would deliberately choose a different story about who she was. One evening, about a year after the documentary premiered, Sarah attended a gala fundraiser for the Domestic Workers' Rights Organization, where she now worked as their director of survivor advocacy. It was a black tie event in a beautiful ballroom, filled with wealthy philanthropists who had donated substantial sums to the organization's work. Sarah wore a deep blue dress that she had chosen for herself, without worrying about whether it would please anyone else. She felt good in her body for the first time in years. Toward the end of the night, as she was mingling near the silent auction table, an older woman approached her. The woman had silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes, and something about her seemed familiar, though Sarah couldn't quite place her. "Sarah," the woman said, extending her hand. "I'm Diane Foster. I wanted to tell you that what you've done, what you're doing, it matters. It matters more than you might know." Sarah shook her hand, still trying to place where she knew this woman from. Something in the way she carried herself, in her voice. "Thank you," Sarah said, "but I'm sorry, have we met before?" Diane smiled, and there was a sadness in that smile. "Not officially, but I've been following your story. I've read everything about the case. I watched the documentary, and I want to tell you something that I've never told anyone before." She gestured toward a quiet corner of the ballroom, away from the crowd. They sat down on a velvet bench, and Diane took Sarah's hand. "When I was 23 years old," Diane began, "I worked as a live-in nanny for a very wealthy family. The father of the family was a man named James Foster. We eventually got married. He was charming and attentive in public, but behind closed doors he was cruel. He told me I was stupid. He isolated me from my friends. He controlled the money. He made me feel like I was lucky to have him, that no one else would want me." Sarah felt her chest tight as she listened. She had heard variations of this story many times now, but it never got easier. "I didn't have a name for what was happening," Diane continued. "I didn't have a support system. I was trapped in that house, and I thought it was my fault. I thought I wasn't being a good enough wife. I thought if I just tried harder, if I was just a little bit smarter, a little bit more beautiful, a little bit more obedient, then he would be kind to me." "How did you get out?" Sarah asked. "I didn't for a long time." 32 years. I stayed married to him for 32 years because I didn't believe I had any other choice. And then one day, he had a heart attack. Sudden, fatal, and I was free." Diane's voice was steady as she said this, but Sarah could see the weight of those 32 years in her eyes. "I had to rebuild my entire life at 55 years old. I had to learn who I was outside of his shadow. It was harder than you might think, because my identity had become so intertwined with his that I didn't know where he ended and I began." "But you did rebuild," Sarah said. "I did. And I've spent the last 30 years trying to help other women avoid the path I took. I've donated to shelters. I've mentored younger women. I've tried to use the privilege and resources that came to me through my ex-husband's wealth to undo some of the damage that wealth without conscience causes." Diane turned to face Sarah directly. "What you're doing is different from what I did. You're not just surviving, you're not just helping individuals, you're changing systems. You're making it so that what happened to you becomes harder for it to happen to someone else. That's powerful, Sarah. That's real change." Sarah felt tears forming, but she let them come this time without shame. "I had a daughter," Diane said. "She was born while I was still trapped in that marriage. She watched me be treated poorly, and I think some part of her internalized the message that women like me didn't deserve better. I lost her for a while. She had her own struggles, made her own painful choices. But eventually, through therapy and time and a lot of hard conversations, we rebuilt our relationship. She's become an advocate in her own right. She works for one of the largest family law practices in the country, and she specializes in abuse cases." They talked for another hour. Diane shared more of her story, and Sarah shared parts of hers, and there was a strange comfort in that exchange. The recognition that while their specific circumstances were different, the emotional architecture of abuse was the same across all contexts and all socioeconomic levels. Before Diane left that evening, she gave Sarah her contact information and told her that she had a proposal. She wanted to establish a scholarship fund, a substantial one, for survivors of domestic abuse who wanted to pursue education or professional development. She wanted to call it the Sarah Richards Resilience Fund, and she wanted Sarah to help oversee its distribution. "I'm not going to lie to you," Diane said. "Using your name this way will bring more attention, more visibility, more scrutiny, potentially, but I think you're strong enough to handle that, and I think the fund could change lives." Sarah accepted, but not immediately. She sat with the offer for 2 weeks, talking it through with her therapist, with Sophia, with her support group. In the end, she said yes, not because she felt obligated, but because she realized that what Diane was proposing aligned with something Sarah had come to understand about herself. She wanted to use her story to build something bigger than herself. She wanted her pain to be a bridge, not a wall. The scholarship fund launched 6 months later with an initial endowment of $2 million. In the first year, it helped 37 people return to school or pursue professional certifications. In the second year, that number grew to 63. Some of the recipients would go on to become social workers, therapists, lawyers, and advocates in their own right. Others would simply build stable, healthy lives for themselves and their families, breaking cycles of poverty and abuse that had seemed unbreakable. But with the expansion of Sarah's public profile came complications she hadn't entirely anticipated. There were interview requests from shows with massive audiences. There were book deal offers. There were speaking engagements that paid substantial fees. And with all of that came pressure to perform her trauma in particular ways, to tell her story in ways that were digestible for mainstream audiences, to make sure that her narrative fit neatly into the boxes that media outlets wanted to put it in. One interviewer, a famous talk show host, spent the first 5 minutes of their conversation asking Sarah increasingly personal questions about what it had felt like to be abused, clearly trying to get her to break down on camera for ratings. When Sarah declined to go deeper into those details, the interviewer seemed almost disappointed. Another publication wanted to run a story with the headline, "From Maid to Millionaire." How Sarah Richards turned her pain into profit, completely misrepresenting both her background and her current financial situation, and implying that she had somehow benefited materially from her abuse. These experiences taught Sarah something important about visibility and narrative control. She realized that by being public about her story, she had also made that story available for other people to interpret, distort, and use for their own purposes. She had lost some of the ownership of her own narrative. It was around this time that she made a difficult decision. She stepped back from some of the public-facing work. She reduced her speaking engagements. She turned down the book deal. Instead, she doubled down on the direct advocacy work, the behind-the-scenes mentoring of survivors, the careful work of building policy recommendations, the quiet conversations that changed minds but never made headlines. It wasn't a retreat, exactly. It was a recalibration. Sarah had learned that she didn't need the world to see her story to know that her story mattered. She didn't need a massive platform to create meaningful change. She could do profound work in smaller circles, with people who had specifically sought her out, who were ready to hear what she had to say. And in a way, that was more powerful than being on television, because the work was real. It wasn't curated for an audience. It wasn't shaped by what would make good television or sell magazines. It was just two people in a room, one person who had survived something terrible, and another person who needed to know that survival was possible. By the 5th anniversary of Marcus Harrington's conviction, significant changes had rippled out from Sarah's case. 3 states had passed new legislation protecting domestic workers. The International Labor Organization had released a statement acknowledging the unique vulnerabilities of domestic workers and recommending that member nations strengthen their protections. Several major universities had created research centers focused on studying domestic work and worker exploitation. And most importantly, perhaps, a culture had begun to shift around the idea that abuse could happen to anyone, in any context, regardless of their background or education or economic status. Marcus Harrington himself was released after serving 4 years of his 5-year sentence, with the remaining year suspended based on good behavior. Sarah had worried about his release, not because she feared he would come after her, but because the legal system seemed, in her view, to be letting him off lightly. 4 years for years of psychological abuse seemed inadequate, but her therapist helped her understand that the justice system's failings weren't her failure. She had done what she could do. She had told the truth. She had stood up. The rest was beyond her control. Still, she did take some precautions. She worked with a security consultant to update her home security system. She changed some of her routines. And she made a point to surround herself with people who loved her and had her back. One Tuesday evening, about a month after Marcus Harrington's release, Sarah was at home preparing dinner when her doorbell rang. She checked the security camera, a habit that had become automatic, and saw a woman she didn't recognize standing on her porch. The woman looked nervous, like she was gathering courage to do something difficult. Sarah considered not opening the door, but something in the woman's body language, the way she was wringing her hands, the way she kept looking over her shoulder, made Sarah think that this woman was scared of something, not necessarily dangerous. She opened the door but kept the chain lock on. "Can I help you?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice neutral and cautious. "My name is Catherine," the woman said. "I'm sorry to show up unannounced. I found your address online and I needed to talk to you, in person. I couldn't do it any other way." "What's this about?" Sarah asked, still not opening the door fully. "I worked for Marcus Harrington," Catherine said. "After you left, I was his housekeeper for 2 years. And I watched what he did to you. I saw the bruises. I heard the things he said. And I did nothing. I was scared and I was young and I just wanted to keep my job and I let it happen." Sarah's first instinct was to close the door. This woman was bringing back something she had worked hard to process. But she took a breath and thought about what Keisha had told her years ago, about how healing required active choice. And Sarah chose, in that moment, to extend compassion. "Come in," she said, removing the chain lock and opening the door fully. Catherine stepped inside, and Sarah could see that she had been crying. Her eyes were red and swollen, and she was shaking slightly. "I'm sorry," Catherine said again and again. "I'm so sorry. I've been wanting to apologize for years, and I finally got up the courage." They sat in Sarah's living room, and Catherine told her story. She had left her job with Marcus after Sarah did. His behavior had only escalated after Sarah's departure, as if he had even less to lose. Catherine had moved on to other positions, but she had always carried guilt about what she hadn't done, hadn't said, hadn't reported. The apology itself didn't undo anything. It didn't erase what had happened. But it did something important. It acknowledged responsibility. It acknowledged that Catherine had been complicit, even if unwillingly. And it gave Catherine a chance to do something different going forward. By the end of their conversation, Catherine had agreed to join Sarah's advocacy organization as a volunteer. She wanted to help other domestic workers understand their rights and their options. She wanted to be part of building a system where other young women in her position would be empowered to report abuse rather than stay silent. After Catherine left that evening, Sarah sat alone in her living room for a long time. She thought about the journey she had taken, from a woman isolated in a mansion, unable to see any way forward, to a woman who could sit with another person's guilt and pain and offer a path toward redemption. She thought about how much harder her life would have been if she hadn't pushed back. If she had accepted the narrative that she was nothing, that she deserved what was happening, that this was just how the world worked for people like her. She thought about all the small choices that had led her here. The decision to call Sophia, the decision to file a police report, the decision to keep going even when the legal process was slow and painful, the decision to eventually share her story publicly, and the decision to step back when public visibility wasn't serving her anymore. None of those choices had been easy. All of them had been necessary. She got up and went to her bedroom, where she kept a journal. She had been writing in this journal for years now, and the entries had changed over time. The early entries were full of pain and confusion. Later entries showed her beginning to process, to understand, to slowly rebuild herself. The most recent entries were reflective, not denying the pain, but integrating it, understanding what it meant about her own resilience and capacity for growth. She picked up her pen and began to write about the evening with Catherine. She wrote about forgiveness, not the kind that minimizes harm, but the kind that says, "I see you. I see that you were scared. I see that you made a choice that hurt me. And I choose not to carry your guilt for you. You have to do that work yourself. But I'm willing to walk with you while you do it." As she wrote, she realized something she hadn't fully articulated before. Her story wasn't a story about victimhood anymore. It wasn't even really a story about surviving abuse, though that was a major part of it. It was a story about what became possible after survival. It was a story about building community, about finding purpose, about discovering that you had more power than you thought you did. Power that came not from wealth or status, but from your own choices and your own integrity. She thought about the Prime Minister's daughter comment that had run through the early news coverage. It was funny, really, how that detail had captivated people. How the media had somehow decided that her story was only important or interesting because of who her mother was, not because of who she herself was. But maybe that had been necessary too. Maybe she had needed the public attention to initially believe that her story mattered. Maybe she had needed the system to take her seriously because of her mother's position, even though it was deeply unfair that someone else might not get that same consideration. And maybe that realization, that unfairness, was part of what drove her ongoing work. Because she knew, with absolute certainty, that there were women and men in situations similar to hers who didn't have a powerful parent to make phone calls, who didn't have access to the best lawyers, who didn't have the kind of platform that could amplify their voice. And for them, the system was even slower, even more indifferent, even more stacked against them